in Manhattan.
Is he?
And I don't think that's very far from Trump Tower. I don't remember the addresses in New York City, but they're pretty close together.
It's very close.
The Associated Press is calling Wisconsin, so that puts him over the top. Donald Trump is the next president of the United States. We can project it on the basis of an Associated Press report that Donald Trump will win the state of Wisconsin. That is 10 more electoral votes.
Elections are how we pick the people who run the country. Today we're going to talk about a few basic terms you need to know to understand elections in the US. First off is the difference between primaries and general elections. We've talked about this a bit, but I'll go over it one more time. You can think of primaries as the initial selection of each party's nominee. So sort of like the early rounds of the playoffs in sports. The general election is when the major party nominees actually go against each other and the winner gets the office in question. You can think of that like the championship. So the primaries are when each party picks its nominee. So it's Democrats running against Democrats, Republicans running against Republicans, Green Party members running against Green Party members. And the general is when all of those parties' nominees go against each other. So Democrat versus Republican. In general, the scheduling of US elections is very consistent and fixed. So there's a presidential election every 4 years. It's on leap years. So 2008, 2012, 2016, 2020, 2024, 2028, 2072, 2648, 2652, 11,504, 11,508, 11,512. So those are the every 4 year elections. In those elections, those are the big ones. You pick the president, you pick a third of the Senate, and you pick the whole Congress. Every 2 years, you have what are called midterm elections. You don't get to pick the president, but you still get to pick a third of the Senate, and you also still get to pick all of Congress. Usually the states sync up their elections with those federal elections, but sometimes they'll have off-year elections as well. New York State in particular has a lot of elections. I vote almost every year in New York State. And those are obviously for local offices like mayor. The New York City mayoral election is in 2021, for example. So it's an off-year election. Elections are very expensive. In, I think it was 2008, the Obama and McCain campaigns predicted that they would spend something like $1 billion each running for president, and prices have only risen since then. Why is running a campaign so expensive? We have to open hundreds of field offices around the country where people go knock on doors. So you have to pay people to do that, you have to rent office space. But the real money is in ad buys, purchasing TV time to run innumerable TV ads where you misleadingly attack your opponent and make yourself look really good is a central staple of American elections. Now, it seems to me like you could have an election without doing any of that. Indeed, there are countries that essentially ban ad buys 90 days out before an election or something, or they restrict campaigning to within 90 days of an election, something like that. You clearly don't have to do this insane knockdown, drag out, hyper expensive American way of selecting a president, but it's what we've chosen to do, and there's no way that you're stuck learning about it. There is a public funding option to run for president. You get a set pool of money, and it allows you to run for president as long as you got at least 5% in the election returns last cycle. So if your party got 5%, you qualify for federal matching funds, it's called. This is generally less than a popular candidate can raise from private money. This is both small dollar donations from people and sort of like large amounts of soft money. We're going to talk a little bit more about soft money and political action committees in a few weeks when we talk about special interest groups. The short version is that money is hugely important in American elections, and it constrains what politicians can get away with. Because if an important industry comes to them and says, if you don't support our bill, we're not going to give you any money for re-election, and you need that money to win. In fact, we might give money to your opponent. Well, the politician is extremely worried about that, and it will often constrain what they're able to do when they're in office. You can't lose the funding of your backers if you want to win re-election. It's very, very hard to survive that blow. Who votes? I'll tell you who votes. Older people, better educated people, higher income people, white people, and black people. Who doesn't vote? I'll tell you who doesn't vote. Younger people, less educated people, lower income people, Latino people, and Asian people. Those are the groups that most commonly stay away from the polls, and therefore their opinions, views, and interests are underrepresented in the political system. If you don't vote, you are invisible in the political system, and there is no reason to think that anyone will try to help you out if you are not making your voice heard. Direct democracy. There are a variety of forms of direct democracy. Direct democracy, rather than representative democracy, just refers to where citizens are allowed to directly vote on a question, often yes or no, rather than electing someone to go represent their interests on that question in some sort of debate in Congress. So for example, if we have a state referendum saying, should New York State legalize weed? And 55% of people say yes, and the thing passes. Now weed is legal. That is an example of a referendum. So sometimes these are called ballot initiatives, referenda. They're much more popular in places like California because they're set by state laws. Some places you can even recall the governor by holding a recall election. That's how Arnold Schwarzenegger became the governor of California. Gray Davis, who was the governor at the time, got recalled, and Schwarzenegger won the election to replace him. So there you go. If you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, you can win an election. There's some advantages and drawbacks to this direct democracy. An obvious advantage is that it cuts politicians out of the loop, and politicians are sometimes dishonest or strange or make bad decisions. A disadvantage is that it is very hard to boil down complex policy issues into a one-sentence ballot question that you then vote yes or no on. So you think of something like the British exit from the EU. This is an incredibly complex topic involving a million different trade deals, agreements, military alliances, passport agreements. And to boil it down into one question, should we or shouldn't we leave the EU, tends to elide a lot of the most complicated, important things about that question. So sometimes you get very simplistic situations where the public just votes yes on all the stuff that kind of sounds good, but doesn't think about the full implications. There was a famous example in the 90s and the 2000s with California. Basically, every time there was a ballot initiative for people to spend more money on things that people liked, like roads and schools, the people of California would vote yes on it, and it would pass. And every time there was an initiative to raise taxes to pay for those things that they had just voted yes on, the people of California would vote no on that because they didn't want their taxes to go up. And so California started building and sending money toward a whole bunch of things while refusing to raise taxes even slightly to pay for any of those things. And as a result, had one of the worst state budget crises in history because they were letting people just do up or down votes on policy issues, and their budget got completely out of control as a result. Those are the advantages and disadvantages of direct democracy, and a little bit of overview of how elections work in the US. Some of the nuts and bolts, some of the terms you might need to know.
A huge new Pew Research Center study of 10,000 American adults finds us more divided than ever, with personal and political polarization at a 20-year high. The number of people identifying themselves as either consistently liberal or consistently conservative has doubled in the last decade. They're less likely to compromise and often decide where to live, who to marry, and who their friends should be based on what they already believe. Joining us now to talk about the new American extremes are Michael Dimick, Vice President of Research at Pew and the lead author on the survey, and Amy Walter, National Editor at the Political Report. Let's start with that self-labeling question, Michael Dimick. 10% in 1994, 2004, 11% in 2004, 21% in 2014. People said they were either consistently liberal or consistently conservative.
Right, and we're not even going by what people call themselves. We're actually asking you a series of questions about major political values, the role of government, social issues, are immigrants a benefit to our society or a harm to our society? And what we're finding is more and more people consistently answering all of those questions in a liberal or a conservative direction. Still a minority at 21%, but doubling over the last 20 years.
Nate Silver kind of gives a different view of the 2016 election from the one that you'll find in common media outlets about what happened and why Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. And also listen to a podcast by Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias called The Road to Polarization. Nate Silver article is really summed up in this table that's in the center of the article. And in it, he goes through a couple of different major topics. I think it's 5 major topics. And then he says what the pre-election view of traditional journalists was, what the post-election view of traditional journalists was, and then what 538's view of the empirical evidence was. So what the evidence actually says, rather than just what media narratives say the evidence says. One of the main ways that 538 is different from traditional political journalism is it doesn't rely on hunches and prepackaged narratives to describe political events. Instead, it relies on an analysis of what the empirical evidence actually says. This sounds sort of boring and common sense and useful, and it is all of those things, but boring common sense is surprisingly rare in political punditry, which makes Nate Silver's work in 538 unusually valuable in this area. So the first element in this table that's in the reading is interpretation of the polling. Now, the pre-election view of normal journalists was that polls proved that Clinton was almost certain to win. People said Clinton is a lock to win this election. Trump has no chance. Post-election view of traditional journalists was that polls showed that Clinton was certain to win, and therefore they should never ever trust polls ever again. Nate Silver's view of the empirical evidence is that polls showed an uncertain and volatile race, with Clinton as a modest favorite and Trump with a real chance to win. The role the Electoral College played. The traditional view pre-election was that the Electoral College provided clear advantage to Clinton because of the blue wall, the country's changing demographics, and her campaign's sophisticated voter targeting operations. The post-election view, after Trump had defeated her, was that the Electoral College was obviously a problem for Clinton, but her underperformance was substantially the result of preventable tactical errors made by her campaign, like not campaigning in Wisconsin, which flipped to Trump. The 538 empirical evidence view is that the Electoral College represented a major vulnerability for Clinton because her voters were disproportionately concentrated outside of swing states and in states that were not particularly close. States like California, New York, and Texas, for example, have high numbers of Asian and Latino voters. Those voters break overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates, but Texas, California, and New York are not swing states, and so votes there are not as important as they would be in a close state like Pennsylvania or Michigan. Another category is the impact of the letter that James Comey, director of the FBI, wrote about the FBI investigation into Clinton's emails. The traditional view of journalists before the election was that the Comey letter was a game changer of self-evident importance. But luckily for Clinton, it almost certainly won't be enough to change the outcome because her Electoral College position is so safe. After the election, after Trump defeated Clinton, the news media said the Comey letter was a marginally important story that the press covered proportionally. Comey can't be blamed for Clinton's loss because her lack of trustworthiness was well established before the letter, and the election shouldn't have been that close in the first place. The 538 view of the empirical evidence was that the Comey letter corresponded with a sharp decline in Clinton's polling of a large enough magnitude to change the election result. The media gave disproportionate attention to the Comey letter and other email-related stories. The media screwed up, in essence. They overcovered the letter relative to its importance. The final element we'll talk about is the role of racial resentment. Traditional view of political journalists before the election was that racism or racially charged attitudes may have helped Trump in the Republican primary, but they were likely a net disadvantage to him in the general election, given the diversity of the electorate. There just weren't enough white voters to elect Trump. Now, after the election, the traditional journalist view was that anger at the establishment and economic anxiety helped lead Trump to victory. Racially charged attitudes may have some correlation with these characteristics, but it demeans Trump voters and reveals liberal partisanship to attribute his victory to racism. 538's view of the empirical evidence is that empirically racism is hard to untangle from other factors like economic conditions and education levels. But the evidence is consistent with racism having had a significant impact on the presidential campaign. I think this piece is useful to read because it gives an empirically grounded counterpoint to a lot of the media narratives that you read about the 2016 election and are currently being produced about the 2020 election. People like to tell stories about everything, but especially about election campaigns. And so that means that you have to be extremely wary about what is a valid reason within an election for a candidate to win or lose or for something to happen in politics, and what is not a valid reason. That is what just seems like a plausible story, but actually there's no empirical evidence for it. When you're reading the news, you should be thinking to yourself, what is the actual empirical evidence for what this person is saying? Are they just spinning stories, or do they have real evidence, data, and argumentation to back them up? The second thing that you had to listen to for today was an interview between Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias about the way that polarization and partisanship work in the electoral system. This is a long, relatively interesting interview that you can listen to at 1.25 speed while you do the dishes or cook or something. So I won't recap it too much here, other than to say polarization remains an incredibly important topic within political science. We've talked about it in the past, high polarization, low polarization, And the way that polarization hooks into people's personal identities is an incredibly important topic for determining how democracies are going to work now and in the future. This is because if your views of the world, if your political views aren't just based on your policy preferences, but are actually hooked into your personal identity, that is, you would say, I have specific identities, being a woman, being a man, being white, being black, and those define who I am. I'm a Packers fan, I'm a Vikings fan, I like mustard on my hot dog. I'm a Sagittarius. I'm a, whatever it is. The identities people have are very important to them, and it's very hard to shake people from their core identities. Here's a tip for you the next time you're discussing politics at Thanksgiving. When you try to sway someone to your side, do not say anything that has to do with their identity. Because if you try to shift someone from what their identities are, like, oh, conservatives don't understand X. Well, your conservative uncle has now just lost you. He's not gonna listen to a word you say. Rather, try to identify and sympathize with their identity, whatever it is. If you try to make your arguments in ways that don't provoke people's identities or attack their identities, you will get much further than if you try to make arguments that directly attack how people see themselves and the world around them. Attacking someone's identity is a good way to just get them to discount everything you just said to them.